The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, golden grass rippling in the wind like waves on a restless sea. Dust clung to her skirts, her bonnet hung askew, and her gloved hands trembled as she clutched the small carpetbag that contained all she owned. Clara Weston had come west with a heart full of hope, believing she was destined to begin a new life as a bride. But now, standing in the middle of a vast and lonely ranch yard, she realized with a sinking feeling this wasn't the right place. The stagecoach driver, gruff and impatient, had left her here without a second glance. He'd tossed her bag, down tipped his hat, and snapped the reins, the horses carrying him away in a cloud of dust, before she could correct him. She had tried to protest, tried to say the name of the man she was supposed to marry, but her words were drowned in the rattling wheels and the cracking whip. And now, silence. Nothing but the creak of a weathered barn door and the distant call of a meadowlark. Clara drew in a shaky breath. She'd never seen such emptiness. No bustling townsfolk, no neighbors walking by, only the wind, the grass, and the faint outline of cattle grazing beyond a crooked fence. The house before her stood tall but weary, its paint faded, its windows dark. It looked less like a home and more like a reminder of how hard life on the prairie could be. Her heart pounded. She shouldered her bag and took a hesitant step forward, determined to find anyone who could explain where she was. She knocked on the wooden door, her knuckles echoing against the silence. For a long, dreadful moment, she thought no one would answer. Then the door opened. A man stood there, broad-shouldered and stern, with eyes as sharp as steel. His face was rugged, tanned from years of sun, and though he wasn't old, life had carved shadows into his expression. He looked at her like she was an intruder, not a guest. Yet his voice was deep-edged with suspicion. Clara swallowed hard. I believe I've been left here by mistake. The driver dropped me off, and Her words faltered under his steady gaze. He studied her a moment longer, then glanced past her at the empty road, as though expecting someone else to appear. This ain't a place for visitors, he said finally. You'd best get yourself back on that stage. Her heart twisted. It's gone, she whispered, clutching her bag tighter. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. My intended is, she gave the name, praying for recognition. But the man shook his head. That's in the next town over. You're miles from there. The words struck like a blow. Clara's throat tightened, and for a moment, panic flared. Alone, stranded, no stagecoach until the next round days away. Before she could speak again, a small voice piped up behind him. Papa, who is it? Clara's eyes darted to the doorway, and there stood a little girl, no more than 6 or 7. Her hair was in loose braids, her dress plain and slightly too short for her growing frame. But what caught Clara most were her eyes, wide, hopeful, and impossibly bright in a face that had known too much sadness. The child's gaze locked onto her, unblinking. She stepped closer, peeking around her father's legs. For a long moment, she simply stared, as though studying Clara with a secret understanding. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she breathed one word that made Clara's heart stop. Mama. The man stiffened, his jaw tightening, but Clara's breath caught in her throat. In that single whispered word, the girl's longing washed over her like a tide, loneliness, hope, and a love that had been waiting, searching. Clara had come to the wrong ranch, but standing there on the doorstep, looking into the eyes of that little girl, she felt a strange shiver run through her. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had brought her here for a reason. The silence after the little girl's whisper was heavy, as though even the wind had paused to listen. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know if she should correct the child gently or pretend she hadn't heard. The widower's jaw tightened, and he shifted slightly, as though to shield his daughter from disappointment. Inside Ellie, he said gruffly, his hand resting on the girl's shoulder. This lady's not stayin'. But the girl didn't move. She clung stubbornly to the doorframe, her eyes locked on Clara as though she feared she would vanish if she blinked. Clara, feeling a tug deep in her chest, lowered her carpetbag and crouched down just enough to meet the child's gaze. Hello, sweetheart, she said softly, her voice carrying warmth despite her own uncertainty. My name is Clara. Ellie's face lit up with something between hope and wonder, though she said nothing more. Instead, she glanced up at her father, silently pleading. The man sighed and finally opened the door wider, though his expression remained guarded. You best come in. Ain't right leaving a woman out on the porch with nowhere to go. Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke and dust. The house was sturdy, but it felt weary, much like the man who owned it. The parlor held a few well-worn chairs, a faded rug, and shelves, lined with books that looked untouched for years. It wasn't the lively, welcoming home she had imagined when she thought of her future as a bride. It was a place where silence had taken root. Sit if you'd like, the man muttered, motioning to a chair. Name's Luke Dawson, and this here's my daughter, Ellie. Clara smoothed her skirts and sat, her carpetbag at her feet. Ellie immediately climbed into the chair beside her, swinging her legs and staring at her with quiet fascination. Clara gave her a gentle smile, then turned her attention back to Luke. I think the driver was confused. My intended groom lives near Milford. He must have left me here by mistake. Luke nodded slowly, scratching his chin. Milford, near 20 miles from here. Next stage, don't run for 3 more days. Her heart sank. 3 days. He gave a curt nod. Afraid so. Until then, his eyes flicked to her bag, then back to her face. You'll need a place to stay. Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his tone held no warmth. He was a man of duty, not hospitality, she realized. Still, he hadn't turned her away. Into the night, and for that she was grateful. Thank you, she said quietly. Luke's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned toward the hearth. He added another log to the fire, the crackle filling the silence. Ellie, still perched at Clara's side, finally broke the quiet with a shy question. Do you know how to braid hair? Clara blinked in surprise, then smiled. Yes, I do. Would you like me to braid yours? Ellie nodded eagerly, sliding down from the chair to sit on the rug at Clara's feet. Her small back straightened, and she handed Clara a loose ribbon she had pulled from her pocket. Clara's hands, gentle and practiced, began weaving the strands of the girl's hair. The simple act filled the room with a warmth that had been absent moments before. Luke watched from across the room, his brow furrowed. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened just slightly at the sight of his daughter leaning against a stranger with such trust. Clara tied the ribbon neatly and patted Ellie's shoulder. There you go. A perfect braid for a perfect girl. Ellie turned, her smile shy but bright. Thank you, Mama. The word slipped out again, unguarded and tender. Luke stiffened, his jaw working as though the sound cut deeper than he expected. Clara's own chest ached at the title. She wasn't this child's mother, and yet, the sweetness in Ellie's voice made her wish if only for a moment that she could be. Luke finally spoke, his tone brisk, as though to push away the tension. Guest rooms down the hall. Best get some rest. Tomorrow'll be a long day. Clara rose slowly, gathering her bag. She gave Ellie one last smile before following his direction. But as she walked down the narrow hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just shifted in some unexplainable way. She had come to the wrong ranch, yet something told her she might be exactly where she was meant to be. The sun rose slowly over the prairie, flooding the Dawson ranch with pale gold light. Clara woke to the soft creak of the old house and the faint smell of bacon cooking somewhere down the hall. She had barely slept, her mind restless with thoughts of her mistake, her future, and the little girl whose innocent eyes still haunted her. Pulling on her dress, she smoothed the wrinkles and tied her bonnet loosely. She had planned to keep to herself until she could find passage to Milford. After all, this wasn't her home. She wasn't wanted here, at least, not by Luke Dodson. But as she stepped quietly into the kitchen, she found Ellie perched on a stool, swinging her legs as she helped stir a pot. The girl's hair was still braided from the night before, though a few wisps framed her face. She looked up, and when she saw Clara, her whole face brightened, as though the morning itself had been waiting for her to appear. You're awake, Ellie chirped, her voice filled with delight. Luke, standing at the stove, turned his head briefly. Mornin', he muttered, his tone gruff but not unkind. Clara offered a polite nod. Good morning. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intrudin', Ellie said quickly, hopping down from her stool and running to Clara. She grasped Clara's hand with surprising strength for her small frame and tugged her toward the table. Sit by me. Clara hesitated, glancing at Luke for permission. His expression was unreadable, though he gave the faintest nod. She let Ellie lead her to the wooden table, where the girl practically pushed her into a chair before climbing onto the one beside her. Breakfast was simple: bacon and biscuits that were more sturdy than fluffy, but Clara ate gratefully. Ellie chattered between bites, telling her about the calf born last spring, about her favorite spot by the creek, about the doll she'd lost in the tall grass months ago. Clara listened, smiling, charmed by the way the girl's words tumbled out like a stream. Luke said little. He ate in silence, his eyes flicking to Clara now and then, as though measuring her presence. She could sense the walls around him, built high and strong. Yet she also noticed how his gaze softened when it landed on Ellie. He was a man who loved fiercely, even if he didn't show it in words. After breakfast, Clara helped Ellie clear the dishes. She carried plates to the basin, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The girl stood beside her, drying with a cloth far too large for her small hands. At one point, their arms brushed, and Ellie glanced up shyly. Can I ask you something? She whispered. Of course, Clara said, smiling down at her. Ellie hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping so low it was almost inaudible. Will you stay? Clara froze, the plate still in her hands. She looked down into those wide, pleading eyes and felt her heart squeeze painfully. Oh, Ellie, she began softly. But before she could continue, Ellie whispered the word again, the word that had nearly broken Clara the night before. Mama. It wasn't just a word. It was a prayer, a plea wrapped in hope and longing. Clara's throat tightened, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She wanted to correct the child, too, explain that she wasn't her mother, that she was only here by mistake. And yet, as Ellie gazed at her with such unwavering trust, the protest died in her chest. Instead, Clara knelt down, drying her hands on her apron. She brushed a strand of hair from Ellie's face and cupped her cheek gently. "I'm not your mama," she said softly, her voice trembling, "but I can be your friend while I'm here." Ellie's face fell slightly, though she nodded. Still, her small arms wrapped tightly around Clara's neck, holding her with a fierce love that made Clara's heart ache even more. From across the room, Luke watched in silence. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense, but his eyes betrayed something else, something he fought hard to hide. He knew the dangers of hope, of letting someone new into their lives. Yet, as he watched his daughter cling to this stranger, he felt the faintest crack appear in the fortress around his heart. Clara held Ellie close, her eyes closing for a moment. She reminded herself she couldn't stay. She had a life waiting elsewhere, a man expecting her. But deep inside, a whisper rose just as soft as Ellie's voice that maybe, just maybe, she had been brought here for a reason. By the time afternoon settled across the prairie, the sky had changed. What had begun as a bright, clear morning now churned, with gray clouds rolling in low and heavy. The wind picked up, whistling through the grass, rattling the shutters of the Dawson house. Clara, standing by the small window in the guest room, pressed a hand to the glass and frowned. The world beyond looked ominous, as though nature itself had decided to lock her in. She had been telling herself all morning that she would find a way to Milford. She didn't want to impose on Luke Dawson longer than necessary. He had been polite but distant, his words clipped, his eyes careful. Clearly, he hadn't invited her presence and only allowed it out of duty. Clara wasn't the type to overstay a welcome, especially where she wasn't wanted. But now, staring at the darkening horizon, she knew there would be no journey today. When she joined Luke and Ellie in the kitchen, he was already looking out the back door at the sky. "Storm's settling in," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd lived on the prairie long enough to read its signs. "Heavy one. You won't be going anywhere till it passes." Clara clutched the edge of her shawl tighter. "How long do storms like this usually last?" He glanced at her briefly, then shrugged. "A day, maybe two." The words sank in like stones. She would be here longer than she'd hoped. Ellie, however, seemed delighted by the news. She clapped her hands together and beamed at Clara. "That means you'll stay with us." "Papa, she have to stay." Luke sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just till it's safe to travel," he muttered, but Ellie wasn't listening. She had already taken Clara's hand, tugging her toward the hearth where a basket of sewing lay. Clara allowed herself to be pulled along. Though her mind raced, she told herself she would keep her distance, remain polite and reserved. This wasn't her home, and this wasn't her family. She couldn't let herself feel otherwise. Yet as the afternoon unfolded, it became harder to keep those walls in place. Ellie insisted on showing Clara her few treasures: a cracked porcelain doll with one missing arm, a ribbon she claimed was lucky, and a book of fairy tales her mother had once read to her. Clara listened with genuine interest, her heart aching at the way the girl spoke of her mother with both love and sorrow. The emptiness in Ellie's small life was as plain as the wide prairie sky. Later, when the storm finally broke, rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the walls. Clara found herself sitting with Ellie wrapped in her lap, the girl trembling at each rumble of thunder. She stroked Ellie's hair and whispered calming words, words that came so naturally it surprised her. She had never been a mother, yet in that moment, the role fit her as though it had been waiting for her all along. Across the room, Luke worked silently by the fire, mending a broken harness strap. But Clara caught him looking just once, eyes flicking to the sight of Ellie nestled safely in her arms. His face was unreadable, but something passed through his gaze. Something almost like longing. When Ellie finally dozed off against Clara's shoulder, Clara carried her carefully to her small bed, tucking her in beneath the quilt. She lingered a moment, brushing the girl's hair back from her forehead, before returning quietly to the parlor. Luke was still at the fire, his hands busy, his jaw set. He didn't look up when he spoke. "She gets attached easy," he said, his tone flat but carrying a weight beneath it. "Don't go making promises you can't keep." Clara paused, his words cutting her deeper than she expected. "I haven't made any promises," she replied softly. Luke finally met her eyes, his expression guarded. "You may not have said the words, but to her, just being here feels like one." Clara lowered her gaze, guilt and sorrow tangling in her chest. She hadn't chosen this place, hadn't chosen this family, and yet, in the storm's fury outside, she realized the truth: she was already tangled in their lives, whether she meant to be or not. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the prairie washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and wild sage, and sunlight spilled through the clouds in pale ribbons. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, and watched steam rise from the damp grass. She should have felt relief that travel might soon be possible, but instead, her heart carried a quiet heavings. Inside, Ellie's laughter echoed a bright, musical sound that had been rare in the house. Clara could tell. The girl skipped into the yard carrying a wooden pail nearly as big as she was. Papa says we need water for the stock, she announced proudly. Then, grinning up at Clara, she added, you can come with me, please. Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding. Of course. They walked together toward the well. Ellie's small hand curled around Clara's fingers. The ground was still muddy, and Ellie's boots made cheerful squelching noises. As she stomped through puddles, Clara laughed softly, a sound that startled her, for it had been too long since she had laughed with such ease. When they reached the well, Clara steadied the pail as Ellie leaned eagerly over the edge to peer into the darkness. It looked so deep, the girl whispered, like it never ends. Clara smiled gently. That's the thing about wells, Ellie. They go down farther than we can see, but they hold the water that keeps us alive. Ellie tilted her head, considering that with all the seriousness of a child trying to piece the world together. Then she nodded. Like Mama's, she said suddenly, and the word pierced Clara's heart. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She simply held the rope and lowered the bucket, letting the creak of the pulley fill the silence. When the pail splashed into the water below, she took a steadying breath. Yes, Ellie, she whispered at last. Like Mama's. They returned with the water, Ellie carrying the handle with both hands while Clara balanced the weight. Luke was in the corral, repairing a broken fence post. His hat was pulled low, his shirt sleeves rolled, and his arms flexed with each swing of the hammer. Clara couldn't help but notice the strength in his movements, the steady rhythm of a man who had built his life with his own hands. Papa, Ellie called, beaming. We brought the water. Luke straightened, wiping his brow, and gave a short nod. Good job. His gaze flicked briefly to Clara, lingering just long enough for her to feel the weight of it before returning to his work. The rest of the day unfolded in small, unexpected ways. Clara helped Ellie with her lessons at the kitchen table, tracing letters in a battered primer, while the child wrinkled her nose in concentration. Later, she mended a torn sleeve in Ellie's dress, her needle moving with practiced ease. Each time Clara offered help, Luke said nothing, but she could feel his eyes on her, cautious yet softened by something he couldn't quite hide. That evening, when the chores were done and supper finished, Ellie grew sleepy in Clara's lap as the fire crackled. The girl's head rested against her, her breathing deep and steady. Clara stroked her hair absently, her heart caught in a tangle of emotions she couldn't unravel. Luke sat across the room, his long legs stretched out, a book unopened in his hands. He watched in silence, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. She hasn't slept that easy in a long time. Clara looked down at the child curled against her. She misses her mother, she said softly. Luke's gaze darkened, and he nodded once. Every day, Clara hesitated, then met his eyes. She's a remarkable girl, brave, kind. You've raised her well. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude quickly hidden. He closed the book and set it aside. I do what I can, he said simply. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that seemed to soften the space. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt less like a stranger and more like something else. A part of their lives, however temporary. When she finally carried Ellie to bed and tucked her in, the girl stirred only enough to whisper, "Good night, Mama." Before drifting back to sleep, Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, her heart aching with the sweetness and sorrow of it. She wasn't Ellie's mother, she wasn't Luke's wife, but as the prairie winds whispered outside, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that she belonged here more than anywhere else. The next day dawned quiet, with a crispness in the air that hinted autumn was not far away. Clara had risen early to help Ellie collect eggs from the hen house. The girl darted ahead, giggling when a hen flapped indignantly at her, and Clara laughed too, balancing the basket on her hip. When they returned, Luke was at the woodpile, splitting logs with practiced swings of the axe. Clara paused a moment, watching him. He worked with a steady rhythm, the muscles in his arms tightening with each strike. He seemed so sure, so strong, and yet she sensed beneath that strength a loneliness as sharp as the blade of his axe. Over breakfast, conversation was like chatting about the calf she wanted to name Daisy. Clara, listening and encouraging. Luke spoke little, though Clara noticed the way his eyes lingered on her hands when she poured coffee, or the way his expression softened when Ellie reached across the table to take Clara's hand. It was later, when Ellie was napping in the afternoon, that Clara found herself alone with him. She had taken her sewing to the porch, the steady pull of the needle soothing her restless thoughts. Luke came around the corner, wiping his hands on a rag, and paused. "Need anything?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, thank you, just mending Ellie's sleeve. She seems to get into everything." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before it vanished. He leaned against the railing, crossing his arms, his gaze fixed on the wide horizon. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of prairie grass in the breeze. Finally, Clara spoke. "She's a sweet child. She deserves so much love." Luke's jaw tightened. "She had it once," he said, his voice rough. "Her mama was the kindest soul I ever knew." Ellie was just a baby when he stopped, swallowing hard, his throat working. Fivo took her, quick and cruel. Nothing I could do. Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. She looked at him, seeing the pain etched deep in the lines around his eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. He nodded once, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Ellie don't remember much, but she feels it like a hole inside her. Sometimes I think she's searching for someone to fill it. That's why. His eyes flicked to Clara, cautious, almost defensive. That's why she calls you Mama. Chest ached, she set the sewing aside and folded her hands in her lap. I never meant to encourage it. I would never want to give her false hope. I know, he said quietly, but to her, it don't matter if it's real or not. She just wants something to hold on to. Clara hesitated, then took a breath. I was supposed to be in Milford by now. I came west as a mail-order bride. Luke's head turned sharply, his eyes searching hers. A bride? Yes. She forced herself to meet his gaze. A man sent for me. I don't know him well, but I thought maybe a fresh start would be best. My parents are gone, and I had no one left back east. I convinced myself marriage would give me purpose. Even if it wasn't for love. He studied her in silence, the weight of her confession hanging between them. And you think that's what you deserve? He asked finally, his voice gruff. Clara blinked, startled. What do you mean? Giving yourself away to a stranger, just 'cause you've got nowhere else to go. That ain't the same as being chosen. His words struck her deeply, unraveling the fragile certainty she had been clinging to. She turned her gaze to her hands, twisting the fabric in her lap. Maybe not, but sometimes we take what's offered, because it's better than nothing. Luke's expression softened just slightly, though his eyes still carried shadows. Better than nothing ain't much of a life. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, Clara felt as though the world had stilled, leaving only their truths laid bare. She wanted to tell him more, that she was afraid, that she had longed for a family of her own, that Ellie's small arms around her had awakened something she thought she'd buried. But the words caught in her throat. Luke shifted, pushing away from the railing. You'll have your chance in Milford soon enough, he said quietly, almost as though he were reminding himself. Don't let Ellie's dreams tie you here. Clara nodded, but as she watched him walk away, her heart whispered the very thing she dared not say aloud, that maybe Ellie's dreams weren't so different from her own. The prairie was quiet that evening, too quiet. Clara felt it as she stood by the corral, brushing down Luke's old mare, while Ellie fed handfuls of hay to a calf nearby. The air was still, the usual rustle of grass muffled by an uneasy hush. Even the birds seemed to have stilled their song. Luke was down by the creek, mending a fence, but Clara couldn't shake the prickle of unease along her neck. She tried to ignore it, humming softly as she worked, but when the horse's ears flicked back and its muscles tensed, her grip on the brush stilled. Ellie, she said gently, why don't you stay close to me now? The girl nodded, skipping to her side without question. Clara rested her hand protectively on the child's shoulder. Moments later, Luke appeared at the edge of the yard, his expression dark, his stride quick and deliberate. Clara, take Ellie inside, he ordered, his voice low but firm. Clara's pulse spiked. What is it, rustlers? He muttered, glancing toward the pasture. I seen tracks. Fresh ones. His hand went instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. Before Clara could move, a shout echoed across the prairie. 3 men on horseback emerged from the rise, their faces shadowed beneath wide hats, their eyes glinting with greed. The cattle stirred uneasily at their approach, and the lead rider spat into the dirt, his grin cruel. Well, he drawled, eyeing the ranch yard. Looks like Dawson's still hanging on to what ain't his to keep. Luke stepped forward, shoulders squared, rifle in hand. Ain't yours neither, he shot back. You'd best ride on. The men laughed, circling slowly. Clara's heart pounded. She tightened her hold on Ellie's hand and started toward the house, but Ellie resisted, eyes wide with fear. Papa. Clara crouched down, cupping the girl's face firmly. Ellie, listen to me. We're going inside now. We'll be safe. Your papa needs you to be brave, all right. Tears brimmed in the child's eyes, but she nodded, letting Clara pull her toward the porch. Luke's voice carried across the yard. Don't take another step. But the rustlers dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, their hands near their weapons. Clara ushered Ellie inside, her heart hammering, and hurried to the window. She knew she shouldn't watch, but she couldn't turn away. The men closed in, and Luke leveled his rifle. This ranch don't belong to you, he said coldly. You try to take what's mine, you'll regret it. The leader sneered. 1 man against 3. Don't reckon the odds are in your favor, Dawson. Clara swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She couldn't just sit idle. Glancing around, her eyes landed on the old shotgun leaning by the door. She hesitated. She'd never fired a weapon in her life, but when she saw Ellie's terrified face pressed against the wall, something fierce rose inside her. She picked up the gun, the weight awkward in her hands, and drew in a steadying breath. Outside, the standoff crackled with tension. One of the rustlers edged toward the barn, and Luke swung his rifle in warning. Don't. Clara pushed the door open just enough to step onto the porch. You heard him, she called out, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. The shotgun shook slightly in her grip, but she held it steady enough to make her point. You best leave before you get yourselves killed. The men turned, startled by the sight of her. The leader's smirk faltered for the first time. Well, ain't this something? He muttered. The pretty lady's got fire. Luke's jaw tightened. She don't bluff, he growled. For a long, taut moment, the prairie held its breath. Then, muttering curses, the leader jerked his chin toward the others. We'll be back, Dawson. Count on it. The three men mounted and rode off, their horses kicking up dust as they disappeared into the horizon. Clara exhaled shakily, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Luke crossed the yard quickly, his eyes sharp with both anger and something else, something like admiration. You could have gotten yourself killed, he said harshly, taking the shotgun from her hands. Clara lifted her chin, still trembling, but resolute. I couldn't just sit inside while they threatened your home, or your daughter. For a moment, their eyes locked, the fire of the storm still between them. Then Luke exhaled, his shoulders dropping. You've got more courage than most men I know, he admitted quietly. Ellie peeked from behind Clara's skirts, her small voice breaking the silence. Mama kept me safe. Luke's eyes flickered, his expression conflicted. Clara's heart swelled and ached all at once, for though she knew Ellie's words weren't truly hers to claim, she couldn't deny the truth of them in that moment. She had kept her safe, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was meant to. The rustlers had long since ridden off, their threats still hanging in the prairie air like storm clouds, but the ranch yard remained quiet, broken only by the restless shifting of cattle and the soft creak of the barn door in the evening breeze. Luke stood in the yard, staring at the horizon long after the dust had settled. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw taut, but his eyes kept flicking back toward the porch, toward Clara, toward the woman who had stood beside him with a shotgun in her hands, trembling but unyielding. He'd expected her to be frightened, maybe even hysterical. Instead, she had shown courage he couldn't ignore. Clara, meanwhile, had retreated inside. She was sitting at the table now, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Ellie curled up against her side. Her heartbeat was still racing, but she refused to let the child see her fear. Instead, she smoothed Ellie's hair and whispered gentle reassurances until the girl's breathing slowed. Luke finally stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his boots. Clara looked up at him, uncertain what she'd find in his eyes, perhaps, or scolding. But instead she saw something different, a mix of weariness, gratitude, and something softer, almost vulnerable. You shouldn't have done that, he said at last, his voice low. Clara's chin lifted. I wasn't going to let them hurt Ellie, or you. If that means I put myself in danger, so be it. Her steady gaze unsettled him more than the gunman had. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his hat in his hands. You've got more grit than most women I've ever met, he admitted, his voice rough. Maybe more than most men. Clara gave a faint smile, though her hand still trembled slightly. I don't know about grit, I couldn't stand by while your little girl was terrified. She looked down at Ellie, whose thumb was tucked against her lip as she drowsed against Clara's side. She's already been through too much. Luke's throat tightened. His daughter, his Ellie, who had cried herself to sleep for months after her mama died, who had begged the stars every night for a new mama, and now here sat a stranger who held her like she'd been born for it. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. When you first showed up here, he said slowly, I thought you were just trouble, a mix-up, something the prairie blew in that I'd best send on her way. Clara's heart clenched, though she tried to hide it, and now Luke's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. Now I can't help but wonder if maybe you were sent here for a reason. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She wanted to believe it too, wanted to think that perhaps this mistake, this stage dropping her off at the wrong ranch, wasn't a mistake at all. But she also knew reality. I was promised to another man, she reminded him gently. I can't just pretend that isn't true. Luke's gaze darkened, a shadow crossing his face. A man who hasn't lifted a finger to come for you. His voice sharpened. You've been here for weeks now, and no one's come riding in to claim you. Doesn't that tell you something? Clara looked down. Torn, her intended groom, had seemed cold and businesslike in his letters, but she'd convinced herself that marriage was her only chance at survival. Yet here, in this small, weathered ranch house, she'd found something far richer than survival. She'd found belonging. Ellie stirred then, murmuring sleepily, Mama. As her little hand clutched Clara's dress, Clara froze, her eyes welling. Luke's breath caught. He reached out, brushing his calloused fingers across his daughter's hair. But his gaze never left Clara. She's never called anyone that since her mama died, he said softly, almost reverently. Not once. Clara pressed her lips together, overwhelmed. She wanted to correct the child, to tell her she wasn't really her mama, but the words stuck in her throat, because deep down, she wished more than anything that she was. Luke leaned forward, his eyes burning into hers. Maybe she sees something I've been too blind or too stubborn to admit. Clara's chest rose and fell, her breath unsteady. And what's that? She whispered. That you belong here, he said simply. With us. Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't heavy with fear or doubt. It was alive with the dangerous, trembling spark of hope. The prairie morning dawned golden, sunlight spilling across the weathered ranch house and painting the fields in warm light. But inside, Clara's heart felt anything but light. A letter had arrived the evening before, delivered by a passing rider, its neat script sealing her fate. Her intended groom, Mr. Barnes of the neighboring town, had written, "I've been informed of your delay. I expect you to arrive within the week. I trust you understand your obligation." No warmth. Number, kindness, just expectation. Obligation. Clara sat at the kitchen table now. The letter opened before her, her hands clenched around its edges. Luke was outside, mending a fence post, unaware of the storm raging in her chest. Ellie, meanwhile, was humming softly as she braided bits of string into a doll's hair, blissfully unaware that the world might soon shift beneath her feet. Clara's eyes stung as she watched the little girl. The child had so easily wrapped herself around Clara's heart, had whispered "Mama" as though it were the most natural word in the world. Could she truly walk away now, just because duty dictated it? Her chest ached with the weight of it. When Luke finally came in, sweat dampening his shirt from the morning's work, he immediately noticed the paper clutched in her hands. His expression hardened as he set his hat aside. "From him?" he asked. Clara nodded, unable to speak. He pulled the chair out and sat opposite her, his gaze flicking to the words before she folded the letter shut. He didn't need to read it to know. His jaw tightened, his voice low. "So, he's finally remembered, you exist." Clara bristled, though her voice trembled. "He didn't forget. The mail can be slow, and he's expecting me. I made a promise, Luke. I can't just pretend that doesn't matter." Luke leaned forward, his eyes dark and searching hers. "And what about the promises you've made here, to Ellie?" His voice cracked slightly, surprising even him. "Do you know what it'll do to her if you leave?" The words pierced Clara's soul. She lowered her gaze, her throat tight. "I never meant to mislead her. I never thought," she trailed off, unable to say what she felt, that she never thought she'd love this little girl so deeply, or that her heart would ache at the thought of leaving her behind. Luke's hand came down on the table, firm but not unkind. "Barnes doesn't care about you, Clara. I can see it plain in the way he writes. He sees you as a convenience. But Ellie," his voice softened, almost broke, "Ellie sees you as her whole world." At that, Ellie looked up, her little brow furrowed. "You're not leaving, are you, Miss Clara?" The room stilled. Clara's breath caught as the child's wide, trusting eyes searched hers. The words tangled in her throat, fighting against each other. She wanted to promise she'd never leave, but the weight of obligation still hung around her neck like chains. "Sweetheart," Clara whispered, pulling the girl into her lap. "Sometimes, grown-ups have to make hard choices. And her voice cracked. "I don't want to leave, not ever." But tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she shook her head fiercely. "God sent you to us. I prayed and prayed, and he sent you. Don't let him take you back." The child's plea broke whatever resolve Clara had left. She pressed her face into Ellie's hair, her tears spilling freely. How could she walk away now? Luke, watching them, felt a tug deep in his chest, stronger than any fear or grief he'd held on to these last years. He reached out, his calloused hand brushing gently against Clara's trembling fingers. "You don't belong to Barnes," he said softly, firmly. "You belong here, with us, if you choose it." Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. The room felt thick with unspoken truth. She was at a crossroads, standing between duty to a man she barely knew and love, the fierce, undeniable love she had already found here on the prairie. Her heart told her the answer, but saying it aloud would mean shattering every plan she once believed was her only chance at survival. "I need time," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just a little time to be sure." Luke gave a single, solemn nod, though his eyes never left hers. As she clutched Ellie close, Clara knew the choice was looming, pressing heavier with each passing hour. One path meant safety but emptiness. The other meant risk but also the family she'd never dared dream of. And deep down, her heart already knew which path she would take. The prairie stretched wide beneath a rose-gold sunset, the field swaying gently in the warm evening wind. Clara stood on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter from Mr. Barnes. She had read it over and over until the words blurred, until they lost all meaning except one: obligation. But as Ellie's laughter rang out from the yard, chasing fireflies with a jar in hand, Clara felt the truth press harder against her chest. Obligation wasn't love. Obligation wasn't family. The screen door creaked, and Luke stepped out, his hat in hand. He paused, as if unsure whether to join her, then leaned quietly against the railing. For a long while, they both watched the child, her laughter dancing like music across the dusk. "You've been awful quiet today," Luke said softly. Clara's throat tightened. She turned the folded letter over in her palm, then set it down on the railing between them. "It's not quiet, Luke. It's loud. Too loud. My head keeps saying one thing, but my heart—" She shook her head, unable to finish. He looked at her then, his dark eyes searching. "You don't owe Barnes your life. You owe yourself a chance at happiness." His voice cracked as he added, "And you'd be giving us the same." Her gaze lifted to his, and for the first time she saw not just the stoic widower, but the man who had been aching quietly, holding back out of fear. He was offering her more than a place to stay. He was offering her his heart. Ellie ran to the porch, her little jar glowing with captured fireflies. She held it high, grinning. "Mama, look." The word slipped out so naturally, so confidently. Clara's breath caught. She blinked rapidly, torn between tears and joy. Ellie beamed up at her, so sure, so full of faith that Clara had been sent to her by God himself. Luke stiffened at the word, his hat twisting in his hands, but he didn't correct the child. Instead, his eyes softened as they met Clara's. Kneeling, Clara pulled Ellie close, brushing a kiss to her hair. Her decision became crystal clear in that moment. She couldn't leave this little girl who had claimed her heart, nor the man who stood silently offering her the home she'd always longed for. She looked up at Luke, her voice trembling. "I can't go back, Luke, I won't. Barnes may have been my duty once, but—" She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "This is my family, you Ellie, if you'll have me." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Luke crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He cupped her face, gently, his calloused thumb brushing away her tears. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "we've already had you. From the moment you stepped off that wagon." His lips met hers in a kiss both tender and fierce, sealing the promise neither of them had dared to voice until now. Ellie squealed with delight, clapping her hands. "See, I told you, God sent her." Clara laughed through her tears, holding Ellie tight with one arm while Luke's strong embrace circled them both. For the first time in years, the widowed cowboy's heart felt whole again. And for Clara, who once believed she had no true place in the world, the prairie no longer felt lonely. It felt like home. That night, as stars blanketed the sky and crickets sang their steady song, Clara tucked Ellie into bed. The little girl whispered drowsily, "I knew you were my mama all along." Clara kissed her forehead, tears shining in her eyes. "And I'll never leave you, sweetheart, not ever." When she returned to the porch, Luke was waiting, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. He reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate to lace her fingers through his. Together, they stood in the quiet night, the burdens of the past falling away, replaced by a love born not of chance, but of destiny. And there, on the wide and open prairie, the woman who had once been lost found her forever home with the little girl who had claimed her as mama, and the cowboy who would love her for all his days.